I want to, I hope to keep your interest a little more because I've been very involved in advertising. And I understand that you are all majoring in advertising. And so I want to address it from that perspective. Um, as I'll discuss, I became an editor of a newspaper when I was 23, right out of college. Um, and it was it was a brand new newspaper, so I had to be involved in a little bit of everything, including advertising. I bought my own publishing company when I was 25, and that totally depended on my learning how to sell advertising and produce good advertising, or I would have gone broke. But instead, I actually turned out to be pretty good at it, and so I doubled the revenue in 1 year, and sold it after 2 years, and with a nice profit. Went back to get my master's degree. At which time, because I had that kind of experience, I was hired to be editor and publisher of a group of four newspapers, actually three newspapers, and I arranged to buy another newspaper, so it ended up being four newspapers. So I have a pretty strong background in advertising. Later on, I was a corporate advertising marketing director, and so I see things somewhat differently than some journalists because I see it from both sides. In fact, maybe three sides: as a journalist, as a publisher, and as an advertising person, a marketing professional. And so you'll see as I go through some of my discussion the different perspectives. And a lot of it, I'm going to talk about advertising. And frankly, not a lot of it, I will not, I say it, my history of media, because I'm so old, I've experienced most of the history of media. So I'm approaching 70 years old. So when I started, um, we were still there was no computers in the industry. um, Certainly not. I was probably the one of the very earliest users of desktop publishing, which is the program we use to produce things electronically now. I may have created the very first college course on desktop publishing. Um, I had never heard of one before me, anyway. So I was very interested in the technology side of it, and I've continued with that. So I do multimedia. In fact, right now we're being recorded. All my lectures go onto YouTube and get embedded back into Moodle, and so forth. So I try to stay on the cutting edge, despite my age. But I have experienced the history of media quite a bit. And so we'll be talking about my history, as I said, my history of media, so to speak. It doesn't go back, to the 1600s or anything, but I've seen a lot during my years. And I'm also a workaholic. And because I'm a workaholic, very frequently I'm doing two things at once. When I was an editor at a daily newspaper, I was also running the university journalism program. When I was had a contract with the state to handle PR for the State Department of Education. I also was running two commercial newspapers, so forth. So it adds up that must be 100 years old, but I'm not quite that. I'm only approaching 70, and I think I like to pretend anyway that I'm a young 70. That I still have lots more to do. I never plan to retire, and I have new projects coming up all the time, and so I'm excited about the industry. All sides of the industry, by the way. So that's my point. Is I'm excited about creating the content. I'm excited about being the boss and making it all happen. And I'm excited about the marketing side because without marketing, you have no product. Um, I will probably say more than this one time, but most media depends on advertising, and advertising follows the audience. And so what we're seeing right now is kind of a destruction in America of traditional media because where has the audience gone? The audience is no longer looking at traditional media. So we'll be looking a lot at the future as well because the audience has gone to the internet, and the advertising has gone with it. And some of my research has been to try to figure out how traditional media can survive because right now they're not doing very well. My the chain of newspapers that I worked for, that had the daily newspaper that I worked for, that was part of a chain of newspapers, and I have a copy of their annual corporate report that they have to publish, and they're bragging in this that they only lost $35 million that year. Well, $35 million here, $35 million there, and pretty soon you have real money. Um, and that's one of the biggest newspaper chains in America. So the newspapers are struggling. My prediction is, and I'll try to find some time to talk about it, although it's not the subject assigned. I think TV is following newspapers. Um, we talk sometimes about tipping points. Tipping points are where you have something that may stand up here, maybe like whatever, that's not going to stand. But anyway, you had a glass of water or something, one of those, you have some water bottles there, and you can tip it away before it falls. We see that more than ever in our society. We see tipping points where things, because of technology, things suddenly go bam, and we say, how'd that happen? Well, we've been tipping for quite a while. But suddenly it gets a certain momentum, you might say, and bam, it falls over, and we're all surprised. An example of that is the tipping point for newspapers. I believe it was in 2000. I don't remember which year for sure. 2004, 2005 was the most profitable year for the Washington Post. They had 900 journalists employed at the Washington Post. So they're doing pretty well. If you can employ 900 journalists, you're doing okay. And they were adding people in I'll say 2005. I may be off a year. They were adding people in 2005. In 2006, they were firing people. In 1 year, it collapsed. The media began, the tipping point in America for traditional media was in 2006, I think it was. And suddenly everything started falling over. All the advertising started going elsewhere, and the newspapers at that time, mainly the newspapers, had to decide, what the heck do we do now? What is our future? And truthfully, they haven't figured it out yet. So anyway, I've a strong background in lots of areas, and you'll see some perspective of my background as we go through. I'm just going to show you just a few slides of things that I have done. This was a bilingual newspaper I did for the state of Washington. I just mentioned them. So it was all about education. I'm fluent in Spanish as well as English, so that was a product I did for the state. This is a magazine that I owned before I came overseas to teach. Obviously an entertainment magazine. You'll see in magazines, you'll be talking about them soon, right? I believe. Magazines, they're doing a little better than newspapers, and one reason is because they're specialized. This newspaper, for example, still exists because all the people actually read the advertising. They pick up the newspaper and read it as much for the advertising as they do for the news content, because they're picking it up to find out about interesting things to go see. So the ads are of interest to them. So it's very easy for us to sell to people that are offering some kind of entertainment, because this is the most prominent entertainment magazine in the area. So that's why magazines are still doing fairly well. They're facing some of the problems that newspapers, but not quite as much. These are publications I did when I was a marketing director. So I used my same skills as a journalist, desktop publishing, to produce flyers, produce books. Actually, I worked for an architectural engineering firm, and so to pursue like $10 million contracts and stuff like that, I'd have to produce a book about that thick, and I had to do that like every week. I'd put one or two of those out, some thick, some thin, as we went after major projects. But I still use my journalistic skills to do that, to be a marketer. We'll talk a little bit about native advertising. These are two examples of native advertising. Have you guys in any of your classes talked about native advertising? Anybody know what native advertising is? Well, it's the fastest growing advertising in marketing. And so hopefully somebody will teach you about native advertising.
You just have to say, that's you, right?
Yeah, it is. A long time.
Harvey.
Yeah, quite a while ago. The one on the right, the native ad on the right, was an ad I produced for the very first newspaper that I was working for. I mentioned I was hired as an editor. We had it was 120,000 circulation in Tampa, Florida, and like I said, while I was the editor, they still needed me to help out with some other things because it was a new newspaper. They were struggling, and they were struggling in advertising. And I will kind of come back to that subject in a second, the mistakes they made with that. But anyway, so we were supporting this candidate, Kotvis, and he was there were 8 people running for mayor of the city of Tampa, and he was number 8. He was dead last, and we offered to take over his advertising campaign, and so I was perhaps one of the first practitioners of native advertising ever. Um, that is an example of native advertising now is finding its heyday online. But newspapers have also figured out, even the Wall Street Journal, New York Times are now selling native advertising because they realize it's so effective and it brings them money. And they're desperate for money right now. So anyway, we started creating pages like this for our candidate because he was not your ideal candidate for Tampa, Florida. Tampa, Florida is in the South. They all talk with a drawl down there. And he was from New York. He had a Bronx accent. And I can't even imitate a Bronx accent. So, and he was very middle class, maybe lower middle class. He'd been a police officer. And so, you know, the rich folks that could donate to his campaign didn't because there was a candidate that leading the pack that was a millionaire insurance man. And so all the rich folks were supporting their buddy, their millionaire buddy. And ours was probably the poorest candidate. But I thought he was the best candidate because he had been a police officer. He had devoted his life to serving other people. When he was elected to city council, he quit his police job, even though the city council was only a part-time job and did not pay that well. He decided to focus full-time on it. And so we built pages like this with reading material. In 3 weeks, we took him from number 8 to number 2 to get through the primary election into what the general election. And he won nearly 2/3 of the precincts in the general election using this. By the end of that campaign year, most of the other marketing companies, consulting firms that were doing the work for their different candidates, not just in this campaign, but other for other positions, were trying to copy what we were doing, but they didn't know how to do it because it took a journalist approach to do this, and they didn't have journalists on their staff. So it was kind of interesting. The last newspaper, the Tampa Tribune, one of our competitors, almost every page in the front section was some bad version of what we were doing. That was interesting. Later on, I ran for city council myself, and with the lowest budget among 8 candidates running for four positions, I had the lowest budget and got by far the most votes, using, again, a native advertising approach to it. This is a blog site I did have up. Anyway, it's no longer up. This is another newspaper, that kind of newspaper magazine, a news magazine, weekly newspaper competing against a daily newspaper. And so we had kind of a magazine cover to it, but it was a newspaper. I do a lot of book publishing. This is a project I took on you see there's some Russian on there. My last, for 9 years, I worked at a university in Kazakhstan, which most of the education is in Russian, and the commerce is in Russian. Our university was English based, like here. Anyway, I started a project there, and we've published 10 books so far. I continue to be co-editor, even though I'm here, not there. Another blog site I do. This one I embed, partly because in America we've found such partisanship in the media now that drives me crazy. You'll notice I have liberal news on this side, conservative news on that side, and my blog in the center, so that they can get a little bit of everything. Another book that I co-authored with one of our former professors here was the editor, but I wrote about half of the book. Anyway, so I have a broad, oops, going the wrong direction here, a broad base of experience. Maybe I will talk a little bit about some of the things I learned from the newspapers I was at. The first two newspapers, first three newspapers, first four newspapers, yeah. And the first four newspapers there in this list, as I said, we did not have desktop publishing yet for those first four newspapers. So when we put together the newspaper, we had a photographic machine that would set the texts for us in nice, it looked really nice and everything, but it would come out in strips, long strips. And so one story would be one long strip. Headlines would be one long strip, even if you wanted to make it multi-lined, it'd come out as one. We had waxers. We had to wax the back of it, and then we cut it and put it in place. And the wax so that you could pick it up. If you did it wrong, you'd put it back into place and take, put in the text, put in the photos. Likewise, wax the back of what we call halftones. A halftone looks like a photo, but it really isn't a photo. For example, a black and white halftone is. Yeah, I'm not. I guess so. Well, I was going to just pull out a marker. There, one there. A black and white in the old days, and maybe it still is basically halftone. Probably still is, but a halftone is made to look like a real photo, but it isn't. In the sense that there are no, the halftone does not have any gray on it. It looks like it has a full range of black to white and all the gray in between, but it doesn't. Instead, you have dots. You have big dots. You have big dots close together, and you have little dots, and with the white background, it looks like a picture. That you think you see a picture, you don't see a picture. So I had to in the dark room, prepare the photos in halftones, wax those, cut those, put those in place. Everything had to be done by hand. Until I didn't put the daily newspaper I was on. Maybe I should have. I should. I won't. Anyway, at the daily newspaper, we were one of the first newspapers in the world to go digital. But even that was different. The first machines we had when we started paginating, doing our pages on computer, the computer was this size, so this lectern. It had two screens, two keyboards, a joystick, and we had to use all of that to put the text in, put the photos in, put the headlines in electronically, and then send them to the back shop for printing. So I think it made its full transition to be totally electronically built in 1992, not really that long ago in the history of things. The first desktop publishing was the mid-1980s. As I said, I was one of the first users of desktop publishing, perhaps the first professor of desktop publishing back in the mid-1980s. So, our electronic age has changed things very quickly since then. Lessons to be learned that relate to you guys, advertising. Don't lie about your circulation. At the neighbor newspapers, I showed up. They had started the newspaper before I got there. They actually had started a print shop first, a printing company, and they were printing uh, big flyers and stuff for the biggest companies in the area. And so they already had a working relationship with some of the biggest advertisers. But the president of the corporation, of our corporation, was a liar. And he was a manipulator, and he thought he could manipulate advertisers. And instead, he destroyed the company. Ultimately, he destroyed the company. Because, as I said, when I got there, part of my job was actually to oversee also circulation. And we ultimately did get to 120,000 circulation because I personally oversaw that we got there. But when they started, the president said, oh, well, we're going to start at 70,000 newspapers. Every day we're going to put out 70,000 newspapers on the doorstep of houses throughout the area. He was incapable of doing that. He was incapable of keeping that promise. And even if he could have kept the promise, even if he really could have put out 70,000 newspapers, he should have lied about it and said 30,000. Because the truth is, as I said, you're selling people's attention in a publication or TV or whatever it is. You are selling people's attention. The first week you put out a new publication, how much attention do you have? Basically nothing. No attention. And so to say you were going to put out 70,000 and act like everybody's going to read the newspaper that first week is very foolish, very stupid. But he lied about that. He said 70,000. They probably put out 30,000. So it took like a month before every major advertiser knew he was a liar, or that the newspaper had no readership or whatever, and they stopped advertising. And all but one or two major advertisers never, ever came back again. So he basically sowed the seeds of self-destruction in his first month of operation before I even got there. A second thing along the same lines, I was there for 2 years, and then the general manager, who happened to be the son of the owner and did not have any real training in it, and didn't really understand. He didn't get it. He didn't understand it. But he was part of a service club of business people. I don't know if you're aware of things like Rotary and Lions Club, and anyway, things like that. I know there are some here, but he was a member of that, and I had been, as the editor, trying to concentrate on the most interesting things we could write about, because even though we had 120,000 circulation, we only put out an approximate 24 pages every week. 24 broadsheet pages, so the biggest pages that you see with newspapers, but still only 24 pages. And about half of that was advertising, so we had about 12 pages of news. And so, because advertising follows the audience, I wanted to make sure we had the most interesting content we could have in order to get people to make a habit of reading our newspaper every week, because that's what we're selling, is their attention. And so some of the stuff I published was kind of controversial. And so going back to my general manager, he was attending these service clubs, and his rich buddies were saying, you guys should not be so controversial. You should be writing about schools and children's groups and stuff like that. You should not be controversial. And so my general manager came to me and said, Ken, I want to change the nature of our newspaper to not to be controversial anymore. And I said, I tried to explain it to Dennis, you're going to kill the newspaper. If the president hasn't already killed it, you will now kill it for sure. Because if you change the content that we're putting out now, you will have no readers. You're going to lose your readership, and you will not sell advertising. Well, he didn't believe me. He believed his buddies. And so I said, tell you what, we're friends. I will stay for 3 months, and then I'm out of here. I'm not going to oversee your destruction of the newspaper. And so that's actually when I started looking and ultimately bought my own newspaper to take over 3 months later. So I gave him 3 months notice, but then I left, and it so happened that he hired a friend of mine from the same university that I graduated from to take over for me. Within 3 months, my friend said, "We've lost all of our readership. We're trying to go back and do what you did, and even more so." They changed to a tabloid, and they became as controversial as they could possibly be to try to regain their readership. By then, they had to start all over again. So within about a year, they had to sell out. They destroyed their own newspaper with their stupidity. So I bought the next newspaper, the Franklin County Graphic, and that one I had to learn everything. I had to learn the the darkroom work. I had to learn how to sell stuff. Every day, every ad was sold by me. I negotiated. I'm a pretty good negotiator, so I negotiated to buy the newspaper for zero down, but monthly payments. But if I ever missed a payment, they got the newspaper back, and I lost all my money. And so I had to sell ads. By then, I was married, had my third child was born while I owned the newspaper. So I had bills to pay, and I needed to sell advertising. At first, I don't think I put the slide on this page, so I'm going to put it on the board here. It's on another PowerPoint, I think. But anyway, as I started studying advertising, I realized that our advertisers that were buying ads from us were doing it for the wrong reason and didn't understand advertising. When you sell advertising, you have to understand what you're really selling. And again, you're selling people's attention, but you need to understand that when you sell advertising, one ad on a very occasional basis does not get people's attention. That's the problem. You have to have a campaign. If they don't understand campaigning, if you have somebody running for president, whatever country, it doesn't matter, they're running for president, they buy advertising, and they think they can buy one ad in each newspaper and each TV station, and that's all they have to do. After all, they've covered all the circulation, and they think one ad will do it. Well, no, it doesn't do it. And presidential candidates know that doesn't do it. And so in America, it now costs close to $1 billion to become president of the United States. Actually, Trump didn't have that much because he got so much social media coverage. But Obama, his first campaign was $800 million, over $800 million. So it's very expensive to be president of the United States. And you have to do lots of advertising, repeat advertising. You need a campaign. That's why they call it a campaign. But when you get to smaller advertisers, they think, no, we can't afford that. We can't afford a campaign. So, we're just going to take one out once in a while. We hope it'll work. But it doesn't. If they don't understand campaigning, advertising rarely does good at all. Very little. In fact, there's a story I read about which got me thinking about this. There was a insurance man in Georgia, and he had been there a long time. He would put an occasional ad in the newspaper, and he only expected to get basically sell enough insurance to just pay for the cost. He never hoped to get any more than that. And so he didn't advertise very much because he didn't make any money off it, was his reasoning. And then he decided to start trying to sell insurance on a national basis. And so he ordered a mailing list. In those days, they were mailing postal, not by email. And he ordered a mailing list so he could send out a flyer to people all around the country. And so then he went to the newspaper, and he said, "Would you print some flyers up for me?" So they printed up, I think it was 40,000 flyers for him. They printed up. They called him up and said, "We have all these flyers for you. You need to come pick them up. We can't keep them in our warehouse. We don't have enough room in our warehouse. so come pick them up. But he hadn't gotten his mailing labels yet. And so he said, well, I don't have any place to put them either. They said, well, they're your flyers, they're not ours. They said, look, how about this? I still don't have my mailing labels. Put half of my flyers into your newspaper. You have 20,000 circulation. Put half of my flyers into your newspaper. I know, I'm not going to get a lot of business from it, but maybe it'll pay for itself, and so just go ahead and put them in. So they put 20,000 flyers in the newspaper. Excuse me, it's a weekly newspaper, I believe. Put it in the weekly newspaper, and it went out to all 20,000 subscribers. They got a few phone calls. They sold a little bit of insurance, and just like he expected, he basically made what he figured. He made enough money to pay for it, and that was it. Now a week went by. He still didn't have his mailing labels. And he gets another phone call. You have to come get your other 20,000 flyers. And he said, I still don't have my mailing labels. Put this 20,000 in the same newspaper. Send it to the same people. I know we won't get any phone calls. I will reprint when I get the mailing labels. So for the second edition, he put the same flyer into the same newspaper to the same people. And what happened? His phone rang off the hook because he had just discovered campaigning. Is that when you advertise, you get people's attention, but to get their credibility, to give them time to think about something, you need a campaign. So fast forward to my situation with the Franklin County Graphic. I was going out, and it was a kind of a small community, and I felt like I was begging for advertising. And so I'd go out, please buy some advertising for me, please, more or less. Please buy some advertising, please. And so they, being nice people and wanting to support their local newspaper, they would buy an ad from me once in a while. So they were doing like the insurance man. Once in a while, they'd buy an ad. And usually it was about, again, the broadsheet paper is about that size, something like that. They would buy a little 8th-page ad down here, 1/8 page. And that'd be it once in a while. So in learning about, campaigning myself, I decided, okay, I need to talk them into doing campaigning. How do I do that? So I went to them, and one other thing I learned was that paper and ink doesn't cost much money. That's not the high cost of being a publisher. Paper and ink doesn't cost much. It's your time that costs much. It's your time that's valuable. And I was spending all my time trying to sell advertising and just barely breaking even. So I needed a way so I didn't have to spend so much time selling. So I said, okay, tell you what. I will sell you a campaign. You buy an ad every week. So they have a contract to buy every week. I no longer have to sell to them because they have to give me an ad. You only pay that much. That's all you pay. But twice a year, you'll get a full-page ad. You get this whole size. No extra cost. Twice a year, you get a half-page ad. And that's supposed to be the number, 2 half-page ads. No extra cost. Twice a year, you get 1/4 page ad, no extra cost. You get free classified ads, those are kind of reader ads. You get 4 streamer ads, like across the bottom. You could put a little ad down here for a streamer. No extra cost. But the other 46 times, weeks, they got their 1-page ad, what they paid for. This, but just the offer itself helped them understand now what do we do? What would we put in a full-page ad? Wow, that'd be interesting. Yeah, a couple times a year we have a really big sale. Let's see, and a half-page ad, what do we do with that? And so they had to start thinking about what they're going to do with a real campaign. And so I got a bunch of people to sign up for that. That made our paper bigger. Another thing about printed products, the bigger you are, the more successful you look, the more people want to advertise with you. And so not only did I sign a bunch of contracts here that I no longer had to go sell every week, now I have time to go to the city 30 miles away and sell ads to them. And suddenly a big Ford dealer every week. All these people have it must be pretty good. I better advertise in it too. And what do you call it? A hardware store. They started buying a full page ad. Some other people started buying ads. So in 1 year from when I started this, I doubled my revenue. So you understand, there's some things you know, when you're talking about advertising, you guys are all going to be advertising, related to advertising. You need to understand these things. Advertising follows the audience. You need to understand campaigning, things like that. Well, I'm going to jump forward. There's again, the example of native advertising that I did. And I was just talking about that. I did have it in this PowerPoint. So that's an example of, that's what I sold them, my campaign. Oh, excuse me, I didn't do 2. I did 4. 4 full pages, 4 half pages, 4 quarter pages, and 40 1/8 pages. Yeah, long time ago. And I'm old. Okay.
Would you advertising?
Yeah, basically, sure. I mean, you have to understand that just because you are an advertising medium doesn't mean you have to sell it. You don't have to sell yourself. You have to market yourself. And then you can be, and also by doing this, I can now become a marketing consultant to them. In essence, I was a marketing consultant to them. I was teaching them how to campaign. They didn't understand how to campaign. So I had to teach them how to campaign so their advertising could be more effective. And in the process, my marketing was more effective. Absolutely.
All of you understand the concept of native advertising? Understand the concept? No? Who doesn't understand that? Honestly. You know what that is? Native advertising? Not really.
Okay, let me come back to that. I did kind of skip over that, didn't I? Native advertising is now the fastest growing advertising in the world. I kind of suggested that, but most of it's online. But the traditional media are selling it now too. The nature of native advertising is that you look like you're not advertising. Basically, you pretend that you're not advertising. Now, legally and ethically, you have to tell people you're advertising. On that ad I showed you, in small type across 8 times across the top, 8 times across the bottom, it says paid political ad, paid political ad, paid political, in really small type. Across the top and across the bottom. So on that page, there's 16 times it says paid political ad on it. The government official who oversaw the election laws and stuff in that area said he read the page before he realized it was an ad. He had to, you know, he thought, wait, this whole page is about this candidate. The newspaper doesn't even like them. And so he had to look a little closer and saw the small type, but that's all that's required. Now in Facebook, I don't think I have it in this PowerPoint. In Facebook, you will see they don't call it native advertising; they call it sponsored. And so as you go through Facebook, you'll see something there that looks kind of like it fits into the regular news stream, but it says on it sponsored. That means somebody paid for it. Effective, just like mine. I mentioned the other marketing consultants didn't know how to do it like I did it. And in the same way, a lot of companies, a lot of marketing consultants don't know how to do native advertising on Facebook either. They look too much like ads. And the whole idea of native advertising is to not look like an ad. It's to look like your interesting content that people should want to read or see or watch the video. It can be video, it can be print text, it can be graphic. It doesn't matter what the content is. It can be online, it can be offline. It is blending in with the what we call organic content around it. So whatever's around it in Facebook, it's the organic posts that you and me and billion people in the world put into Facebook, they slip those ads in between all that organic material. And if they're good at it, you won't even know, you may not notice it's sponsored at all. But even if you do, even if you're like me and I'm very conscious of it because I'm, that's my business. If they're really good at it, I will watch it anyway because the content is good enough that it's interesting. Like one you might have seen on Facebook, there's a company that does drone videos. They'll have a video of an entire country taken by drone. It's sponsored, but it's great video. So yeah, if I have time, I want to watch, the Ukraine by video, the flyover of Ukraine or the flyover of Malaysia or whatever they happen to be showing at the time, because it's good content, but it's paid content. So native advertising is made to look like the surrounding content, the surrounding organic content. So that's what I did. And like I said, the supervisor of elections did not know it was advertising until he looked a little bit closer. And if it's done well enough, you may not notice when it's on Facebook or someplace like that. It's projected by 2 years from now, it will be 75% of all online display advertising will be native advertising. And so it's growing very, very fast. And if I can get to that, we'll see some slides on that. One of the concerns, and this does go back a little bit more into content that is in the book, one of the big concerns over the years, especially by academics, has been conglomerates. Big companies own lots of media. And so lots of the of academics especially they feel like they're taking over the world, basically, and that they spin the truth. They don't always tell the truth. They have content that is positive to them and so forth. And I'm not saying there's no concern about that, but as I go through, I'll explain why you shouldn't be as concerned. Actually, these people you don't need to be concerned with. Facebook, Google, you need to be concerned with. These people are on the way out. They're dying now. They have some businesses. Hollywood business is still good. They have some strong businesses, but most of the businesses that these conglomerates are involved with now are losing viewership. Therefore, advertising follows the audience. They're losing audience. They're losing advertising. So we don't have to worry about them anymore, hardly. So these are the 6 companies that control a good share, even now to a large degree, of the media content. Except you notice there is no Facebook there. There's no YouTube there. So basically, half of the media content is not showing here anymore. Okay, it used to be this was most of the media content a few years ago. Not anymore. There's no Netflix there, I don't believe. But there's no YouTube there. There's no Facebook there. There's no Twitter there. There's no, etc. You get the idea. So some of them are trying to make more of an impact on the online. Even the company, my former company that I was telling you about, that's losing $35 million a year still, is trying to have more of an online presence to save themselves. But these companies are losing money, or they're in the process of losing. If they make a profit, they're losing more and more of their profit, and some of their companies are going to lose a lot more money soon. They're reaching their tipping point. An Australian academic, however, he was really concerned. He does videos. You can see some videos from him in a book about the control of global media. He's concerned that he thinks that they're even they've started wars. He tracks it back quite a ways of the things they've done for their own personal interest. And again, I'm not saying there's nothing to worry about there and that they haven't done some harm. I happen to think the bulk, the mainstream media in America right now is become very corrupted. and that concerns me a lot. But because they become corrupted in the sense that they have become so partisan that you can't trust them anymore. Just to give you an idea of what America looks like, you notice with our presidents over the last many decades, Republican, Democrat, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat. What would you present? What would you guess from that? Fairly even split, right? Which means the people in America are pretty evenly split between Democrat and Republican, the conservative and liberal.
I would even think something else. Just sorry.
Go ahead.
Very quickly. It won't change.
We don't know.
Back and forth.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm saying though that because of what's going on in the media, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the future. And there are people who think that there's a lot of people who would vote more conservatively, except they are being kind of propagandized to in such an immense way that they don't understand what's going on. And that is a concern. Over the Gallup poll showed actually there were more conservatives than liberals in several polls. That as far as self-identifying, are you more conservative, are you more liberal? People over the years have identified with conservatives and moderates and not as liberals. But in the news media, we see that a survey of editors by an association of editors, so it should not be conservatively biased anyway, that there are 4 times as many Democrats or self-labeled Democrats or liberals as there are Republicans or conservatives. And I think that's actually a little bit old. It might be worse than that now. Over in a survey by Pew, the Pew Center, which again is actually fairly liberal, they're measuring their survey of journalists, not just editors, but just journalists. 34% liberal journalists, 54% moderate journalists. They self-identify as moderates. They may not really be moderates. They've learned to say I'm moderate. And only 7% who self-identify as conservatives. There also may be more conservatives who are afraid to admit that they're conservatives in the current environment. So these are self-identifying what they say of themselves. So this does not reflect the general public in America. And because of that, over the last 20 years, the media have strongly favored the Democrats. For example, McCain ran against Obama in 2008. McCain had 57% negative stories about him. Obama had only 29. Obama had 36% positive stories towards him. McCain only had 14%. Recently, by the way, the media, because now that he's dead and not a threat, they've been all very pro-McCain. But when he was a threat, it was all negative. And so even though Obama had almost twice as much money as McCain, his donation for running his campaign was $326 million. He would have set a record at this. But Obama had twice as much as he did. Even with twice as much money, Obama only got 53% of the vote. So he just barely did by that much, considering he had twice as much money to spend on his campaign. So the liberal, clearly, I think the liberal media swayed this campaign a lot. And another organization, excuse me, this was a study done by a UCLA professor and a University of Missouri professor. I'm not going to go into all the methodology they use, but basically what they wanted to see was how, in comparing news sources, how liberal or how conservative were the media. And in looking at the 20 top media in America, 18 of them use more liberal sources than conservative sources on a consistent basis. So if you are a journalist and you're using more liberal sources than conservative sources, you're probably going to sway your readers that the liberal side is the right side. And again, liberal and conservative, by the way, it's hard to take to a new country. Every country is different. I'm in America, I am conservative. In Kazakhstan, I'm liberal because it depends what's going on in your environment. And so in America, I was trying to conserve the Constitution, trying to conserve some of the traditions, I guess you could say. In Kazakhstan, I was trying to change it and get more freedom of the press, more freedom of speech. So there I'm a liberal. In America, I'm a conservative. In Kazakhstan, I'm a liberal. So you kind of, that term is kind of confusing sometimes, and I'm not going to go into what makes you a conservative in America. Just a couple of samples, though. Conservatives are anti-abortion. Liberals are pro-abortion. So there's things like that. Anyway, so all these media, except Fox and Washington Times, consistently use more liberal sources than conservative sources. The other two flip it a little bit. They're more conservative sources than liberal. So again, the mainstream media of America have a liberal influence on society. In addition to that, 98% of the donations that come out of Hollywood go to liberal causes, or they can identify as liberal, and their donations are 7-1 liberal. And the universities are also controlled by liberals in America. So a survey of 1,600 faculty, 72% self-identify as liberal, only 15% conservative. And as far as parties go, 50% self-identified as Democrat, 11% as Republican. Okay. Well, in trying to show you then real quickly what is happening, I'm going to skip forward to where we're at now. Tipping point I was talking about. And I mean, it should be no surprise to you that people are going online. And there was a tipping point in that, especially with video, that happened with the mobile. Mobile suddenly brought broadband to places all around the world that didn't have broadband before. And so in that 1 year, between June 2011 and June 2012, it increased by fivefold, more than 5 times in 1 year. And most of that was probably because of mobile broadband. Suddenly people were watching a lot of YouTube. That was one of the easy things to transfer from the laptop or desktop over to mobile was YouTube. So everybody was watching YouTube videos immediately as they got their mobile device. This is what happened in newspaper advertising. In 2003, newspapers were making about $45 billion in advertising as a group, and their digital advertising was 1.2 billion. They were making a little bit on digital already. And here was Google in 2003. Not much. They were not a threat. Newspapers were not afraid of Google in 2003. 2004, they came up. The newspapers stayed about the same. 2005, that must have been the tipping point year I was talking about, not 2006. 2005, the newspapers were still doing great. Google was coming up. 2006, now the newspapers started losing money, and Google was coming after them. 2007, you see what happened. Now look over at 2014. Newspapers have lost 2/3 of their advertising in America, and Google is dominating the industry, dominating marketing. Facebook, by the way, Google has 2 types of advertising we need to talk about. One is search advertising. And so when you do a search, you'll see some paid search ads there. They make about half their money off of search advertising, and the other part is display advertising, which might be over on one side possibly, or they also get a lot of display advertising on YouTube and some of their other companies they own. Facebook it is about the same in display advertising, but they don't have search advertising. So they're behind Google in overall advertising. They might actually be a little ahead of them in display advertising per se. But you see where American newspapers are at. They are dying. They're laying off people. As I said, they've lost 2/3 of their advertising. They're trying to build up their websites, but they don't know how to. They're not getting their audience to follow after them. I did a presentation on how to save the New York Times. And in a book chapter I did was basically the same thing, but talking about media, how to save the traditional media. One thing I said that they need to understand, they need to stop thinking that they're competing against each other. Because each other is not the one stealing their advertising. It's Google stealing their advertising, Facebook stealing their advertising, Twitter stealing their advertising. You know, the New York Times is not stealing Washington Post advertising very much, and the Washington Post is not stealing other people's advertising because they're all dying. But it's the online media they're stealing all the advertising, and unless they can change the way they're working to compete against Google and Facebook, they will almost certainly die. Most of them will die. In America, within the next 10 years, probably, I'm guessing 90% of the newspapers will be gone in 10 years. I don't see how they survive more than that. A lot of them are going, as I said, my former employer still losing $30 million a year, $35 million a year. The year before that, they're positive because the year before that they lost over $300 million. The year before that, so they are making some changes. Their income's actually lowering, but their loss is lowering also because they're getting more into digital and cutting back some of their lesser profitable traditional media, things like that. But here's another slide that kind of shows what's happening through 2014. The orange on the top is their digital advertising. The black is their print advertising. So you see what's happening. In 2014, they made only a little bit more than they made in digital advertising in 2007. So their digital advertising is not increasing, and their print advertising is disappearing. Now they're trying to make some changes, but I think they're too late to save themselves in most cases. But my suggestion was, first off, they need to work together more. The newspapers of America should start their own version of Facebook, in essence. They need to go head to head with them. They need to promote something, and then they can link back to all their own web pages because nobody's going to their web pages. So they need to work together to fight Facebook and Google and the other online competitors. They need to think more multimedia. Survivors, to me, in the industry, will be multimedia. Even those that are primarily video will probably still have some text. They'll still have photos. They will be true multimedia. Those that don't will lose some of their audience because some people do like to read, and some people do like to look at photos. Some people would like to watch the video forums and so forth. Most people, video is the most popular. There's no question. Advertisers, 90 to 95% of advertisers say that video is the most powerful form of advertising. So what's that tell you about the traditional media? They need to be selling video advertising. Newspapers haven't apparently thought about that. Gee, on the website they could be selling video advertising, and they could be doing combos. They could be they could do a print ad on with the same advertiser, and then have the same ad online, but also a video with them and so forth. They need to think video. They need to, when they send out a reporter, the reporter needs to go out with his mobile phone. He needs to video record his interviews. He'll probably use about 10% of that in his print story. The whole entire thing, the 100% of his video interview can go on the internet. They could have discussion groups on the internet. They certainly, and all that then makes their video advertising more effective. They need to think about beyond news, like book publishing. They might even, somebody like the New York Times could get into um, internet services. In fact, the the PowerPoint I don't have time to show you here real quick. I'll try to finish. I'm trying to finish up here, but they actually showed that one of the most expensive things that a newspaper does is distribute. The most expensive is paying salaries. Probably the second most expensive thing they do in a newspaper is to distribute the newspaper. Sending it out in America, it goes house to house to house. Very few newspapers send it by mail. It's almost all house to house delivered, usually by 12-year-old boys or something. But that's very expensive to do that. And so an analysis of the New York Times showed that in 1 year they could afford to give every subscriber their own iPad. If they would agree to subscribe to the newspaper long term, they would be making money if they said, okay, we're going to stop printing the New York Times. You subscribe for 3 years, we will give you an iPad to read our newspaper on. And in fact, we'll customize the iPad so it comes right up to our newspaper. And they could put some other stuff on it. They could start doing more video, so forth. They would actually save money by giving away iPads and stop printing. But most newspapers won't do that. But that's the circumstances right now where they're trying to survive, and it's very hard to survive in the current environment because they haven't figured out how to compete. They're competing against each other, and they're losing all their advertising to Facebook and Google and Twitter. So that's why they will probably die. They can't figure it out. And I'm a print guy. I'm a print journalist. So, okay. I think we're going to take a break and then come back for questions or something.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We just watched the rise and the emergence of the newspaper, and Dr. Ken told us about the death.
And TV, it's going to happen to TV too. I said TV, the tipping point is that TV. In 2016, TV's advertising sank below digital advertising for the first time. And there's other reasons why we're at a tipping point for TV also. TV, just real quickly, TV stations in America get most of their money, their profit is coming from, cable companies have to carry the local programming of the local TV stations in America. I don't know if they do locally or not, but in America they do. They're required to carry local TV coverage. And so because they're carrying the local TV coverage, they have to pay the local TV stations for that content. That's where they're making all their profit right now. And so actually in the last few years, they've actually been selling selling TV stations at the highest price ever. But what the buyers of the TV stations haven't bothered to look at is what's happening to their cable. See, this is what's happened to their TV transmission fees. Retransmission fees have been going up and up and up. But nobody's told them, guess what? That's what's happening to your audience, and it's going to go faster. Just like with TV, just with the newspaper, you are about to have a collapsed audience with cable. And once cable audience collapses, local TV station lose their profitability immediately. I'm not sure where we're at. This is as of 2014. My prediction in 2016 was that we had just reached our tipping point for TV type content. And we could talk about that more later if you want to, because there's reason to think, like this was in 2016, I think, those who thought they were extremely likely to cancel pay TV, meaning satellite TV or cable, those who are very likely, those are moderately likely, and this was at the very beginning of the tipping point. This was 3 years ago. It's down to be going much worse than that at this point. And as word spreads, guess what? You get a better deal on Netflix. Guess what? Word starts spreading. And there are more competitors online now. Disney's coming online. Netflix I think last year, they announced they were going to spend $8 billion on new content on Netflix. Disney announced they were going to come in with a couple $1 billion. Um, anyway, there's a whole bunch of companies that are coming in with $1 billion commitments to compete with Netflix. And guess what? Who also they're competing with? Cable, satellite TV, and local TV. So these, anyway, that's where we're at.
Things like automotive.
Sorry.
That's good for us later on. I hope you kind of made some notes, at least in your mind, so we have a little conversation afterwards. Let's just say 5:15 we continue. Just a little pause.